There is a particular kind of emotional tension that does not announce itself loudly. It does not begin with conflict or confrontation. It begins with something far more subtle, a sense of being pulled in two directions at once. On one side, there is love. Not just attraction, but a deeper emotional connection. Someone who feels chosen, desired, and understood. A relationship that offers intimacy, possibility, and the sense that life is expanding. On the other side, there is loyalty. Loyalty to family. Loyalty to the people who raised him, who shaped him, who invested in his life long before this relationship ever existed. Loyalty that is often not explicitly demanded, but deeply expected. And when these two forces come into conflict, something important happens. The man is no longer just making a romantic decision. He is navigating a psychological crossroads between who he feels drawn to and who he feels obligated to be. This is where the emotional conflict becomes internalized, because love pulls him forward, toward connection, toward individuality, toward choosing a partner based on emotional truth. Loyalty pulls him back, toward tradition, toward expectation, toward preserving harmony within his family system. And in the middle of these two forces, he often becomes stuck. Not because he lacks clarity, but because both directions carry meaning. Both feel justified. Both feel important. And that is what makes this conflict so difficult. It is not about right versus wrong. It is about two rights competing for priority. From a psychological perspective, this is a conflict between autonomy and attachment. Autonomy asks, what do I want? What aligns with my identity, my desires, my future? Attachment asks, what maintains my connection? What preserves my belonging? What keeps me emotionally safe within my family system? And when these two needs are not in alignment, the result is often emotional tension. Because choosing autonomy may feel like risking attachment, and choosing attachment may feel like sacrificing autonomy. So instead of moving forward decisively, the man may find himself hesitating, trying to hold both at once. But the human psyche does not function well in prolonged duality. When a person tries to remain in two conflicting emotional states simultaneously, it creates internal friction. Over time, that friction becomes anxiety, uncertainty, and emotional fatigue. He may begin to overthink, to second-guess, to revisit the same questions repeatedly. Am I making the right choice? What will happen if I go against my family? What will I lose if I walk away from this relationship? And the more he asks these questions without resolving them, the more stuck he becomes. Because indecision in this context is not neutral, it is active. It creates an emotional vacuum where clarity should be. And in that vacuum, both love and loyalty begin to feel strained. His partner may feel the absence of certainty, his family may feel the tension of resistance, and he himself may feel like he is being stretched in ways that are difficult to sustain. This is where emotional pressure begins to build, not externally, but internally. And pressure, when it is not expressed or resolved, does not disappear, it intensifies. So the man finds himself in a position where every option carries a cost. If he chooses love, he risks disappointing his family. If he chooses family, he risks suppressing his own emotional truth. If he avoids choosing altogether, he risks losing clarity in both directions. And this is the paradox of the situation. There is no choice without consequence. But instead of accepting that, many people try to delay the decision, hoping that time will resolve the conflict. But time does not resolve emotional conflict on its own. It only reveals it more clearly. Because as time passes, the relationship continues to evolve, or struggle to evolve, and the family dynamics continue to exert influence, and the internal tension does not remain static, it deepens. So the question becomes not whether he will face consequences, but which consequences he is willing to accept. And that is where this moment becomes deeply philosophical. Because at its core, this is not just about love or family, it is about ownership. Ownership of choice, ownership of identity, ownership of the direction of one's life. Because as long as he remains stuck between love and loyalty, he is not fully choosing either. He is existing in a space of hesitation. And hesitation, while understandable, comes at a cost. It can slowly erode the emotional stability of the relationship. It can create distance between him and his partner, and it can increase the emotional weight he carries internally. So what appears on the surface to be a romantic dilemma is, in reality, a deeper existential one. Who am I in the face of conflicting expectations? What do I stand for when the people I care about do not agree? And perhaps most importantly, can I trust myself to make a decision even when that decision will not satisfy everyone? Because the ability to hold that kind of tension, to move forward despite the lack of universal approval, is a sign of emotional maturity. Not because the choice is easy, but because it is owned. And ownership changes everything. Because once you own your decision, you are no longer just reacting to the conflict, you are engaging with it from a place of clarity. And that is the first step toward moving forward. Not perfectly, not without loss, but consciously. And that is the difference between being stuck between love and loyalty and choosing to live a life where your decisions are truly your own. And the question that remains is this: if you do not choose, are you truly honoring both, or are you quietly losing yourself to both? To understand why family approval holds such power, especially in a man's life, we have to look beyond the visible disagreement and into the deeper structure of how identity is formed. Because family is not just a group of people. It is the first system we belong to. It is where we learn what is acceptable, what is expected, and, perhaps most importantly, what earns us love. For many men, that learning happens early and often without words. Approval is felt when behavior aligns with expectations. Disapproval is felt when it does not. Over time, this creates an internal map. This is how I stay connected. This is how I remain accepted. And so, family approval becomes more than just agreement. It becomes a form of emotional security, not necessarily conscious, but deeply ingrained. This is why, when a man's family expresses disapproval of a partner, it is rarely experienced as a simple opinion. It is felt as a disruption in that emotional security, a signal that something important is at risk. Because the underlying question is not just, do they like her? It is, what does this mean about me if they don't? This is where the psychological weight becomes significant. Family approval is often tied to identity, especially in environments where the collective is prioritized over the individual. In such contexts, decisions are not just personal, they are relational. They reflect on the family as a whole, on its values, its reputation, its cohesion. So when a man chooses a partner, he is not only making a romantic decision, he is making a statement about himself within his family system, and that statement can be perceived in multiple ways. From his perspective, choosing love may feel like authenticity, a step toward defining his own life. But from his family's perspective, it may feel like deviation, a move away from shared expectations. And this is where tension begins to form, because approval and autonomy are two different emotional currencies. Approval says, you are aligned with us. Autonomy says, you are defining yourself. And while both are valid, they are not always compatible in moments of conflict. This creates a psychological dilemma for the man, because on one hand, he is seeking connection with his partner, intimacy, understanding, emotional depth. On the other hand, he is still oriented toward maintaining connection with his family, respect, continuity, and belonging. And when those two forms of connection are at odds, the internal system begins to destabilize. He may start to question his judgment, not because he lacks insight, but because external validation has been deeply embedded in his sense of certainty. This is where self-trust becomes fragile. Because when a person has learned to rely on external approval to feel secure in their decisions, disagreement can feel like invalidation, and invalidation can feel like uncertainty. So instead of standing firmly in his choice, he may begin to oscillate, seeking reassurance, revisiting decisions, attempting to balance both sides in a way that feels safe. But safety, in this context, is often tied to avoidance of conflict rather than clarity of direction. And that creates a subtle but important distinction, because there is a difference between making a decision that is comfortable and making a decision that is conscious. A comfortable decision avoids disruption. A conscious decision acknowledges it. And in situations like this, disruption is often unavoidable. So the question is not how to eliminate it, but how to navigate it. One of the challenges here is that many men are taught implicitly that maintaining family harmony is part of their role, that being a good son means minimizing conflict, preserving peace, and respecting the boundaries set by the family. And those are not negative values. In fact, they can be deeply meaningful. But when those values become rigid, they can limit emotional development. Because at some point, the role of a son must evolve into the role of an individual. And that transition requires redefining what loyalty actually means. Is loyalty about agreement, or is it about respect? Is it about compliance, or is it about connection? Because you can disagree with your family and still care deeply for them. You can choose differently and still remain connected. But that requires a shift from viewing approval as the foundation of the relationship to viewing understanding as the foundation. And that shift is not always easy to make, because it involves tolerating the discomfort of being misunderstood. And for many, that is one of the most difficult emotional experiences to sit with. The fear is, if they don't understand my choice, do they still understand me? But understanding and agreement are not the same thing. Your family can understand your reasoning and still disagree with your decision, and you can respect their perspective without adopting it as your own. That is where emotional maturity begins to take shape. The ability to hold difference without collapsing into guilt or defensiveness. Because without that ability, the man remains dependent on approval to feel secure in his identity. And that dependence limits his capacity to choose freely. So what is really at stake here is not just a relationship decision, it is the development of self-trust. Can he make a decision and stand by it even when it is not fully supported? Can he tolerate the emotional discomfort that comes with disagreement? Can he define loyalty in a way that includes both respect for his family and respect for his own life? These are not abstract questions. They are the foundation of how he will navigate not just this situation, but future decisions as well. Because the moment he begins to trust his own judgment, something shifts. He is no longer making decisions out of fear of disapproval. He is making decisions based on alignment. And that changes the entire dynamic. Not immediately, not without tension, but decisively, because a man who can hold both love and loyalty without losing himself is no longer simply reacting to expectations. He is choosing, and that is where his life begins to move forward. So the real question is this: are you living in a way that earns approval or in a way that earns your own trust? When a relationship exists under pressure, what often changes first is not the love itself, but the experience of that love. The emotional atmosphere shifts. What once felt natural begins to feel uncertain. What once felt secure begins to feel fragile. And what was once a space of connection slowly becomes a space of questioning. Because love does not exist in isolation. It exists within a context. And when that context includes disapproval from family, the relationship is no longer just between two people. It is being influenced by forces outside the couple's control. And that changes how the relationship is felt from the inside. One of the first things that emerges is emotional ambiguity. The partner begins to ask, where do I stand in this person's life? Not just in words, but in behavior, in decisions, in priorities. Because love is not only expressed through feeling, it is expressed through positioning, through the choices we make when we are under pressure. And when those choices are unclear, it creates a gap between what is said and what is felt, between intention and action, between connection and certainty. For the partner who is not part of the family system, this gap can feel destabilizing, because she is not just investing in the relationship, she is also navigating uncertainty about its direction. And uncertainty over time is emotionally exhausting. It requires constant self-regulation, constant interpretation, constant internal questioning. Am I being chosen? Am I being prioritized? Is this relationship moving forward, or is it being held in place? And when those questions go unanswered, the emotional cost increases. Because humans do not only seek love, we seek clarity. We need to know where we stand in order to feel secure enough to invest fully. Without that clarity, the instinct is often to protect oneself, to hold back, to reduce vulnerability in order to minimize potential hurt. So the partner may begin to shift, not consciously but gradually. She may become more guarded, less expressive, more cautious with her emotional availability, not because she loves less, but because she is trying to manage the uncertainty of the situation. And this is where the relationship begins to change. Because when one person pulls back, the dynamic shifts. The emotional rhythm of the relationship is no longer balanced. One person may be seeking reassurance, while the other is seeking stability. One may be reaching, while the other is retreating, and in that imbalance, tension builds. At the same time, the man is also experiencing internal strain. He is not indifferent. He is not disconnected. He is often deeply aware of the pressure, the expectations, and the emotional stakes involved. But awareness does not always translate into clarity. He may find himself trying to manage both worlds at once, his partner and his family, without fully committing to either in a way that resolves the tension. And in doing so, he may unintentionally create a state of emotional suspension, a place where the relationship is neither fully moving forward nor fully stable. And this is where the concept of being stuck becomes real. Because being stuck is not just about inaction, it is about unresolved action. It is about being in a state where something needs to be decided, but the decision is continually postponed, and in relationships, postponement is not neutral. It communicates hesitation, it communicates uncertainty, and over time, it can begin to feel like a lack of commitment, even if that is not the intention. This is where the relationship becomes vulnerable, not because the love is gone, but because the structure supporting that love is not stable. Because love, to sustain itself, requires more than feeling. It requires direction. It requires a sense that both people are moving towards something together, not just emotionally, but practically. And when that direction is unclear, the relationship begins to feel unanchored. Another important dynamic that emerges is the question of choice. Because the partner is not only asking, "Do you love me?" She is also asking, "Have you chosen me?" And those two questions are not the same. Love can exist without clarity, but choice implies action. It implies priority. It implies a willingness to stand behind the relationship, even when it is challenged. And when that choice is not clearly expressed, it creates doubt. Not necessarily doubt about the existence of love, but doubt about its strength, its stability, its future. And doubt, if left unaddressed, becomes distance. Not always physical, but emotional. Because when someone does not feel chosen, they begin to withdraw. Not out of anger, but out of self-protection. And that withdrawal changes the tone of the relationship. Conversations become more measured. Emotions become more contained. The spontaneity that once defined the connection begins to fade. And what remains is a relationship that is functioning, but not fully alive. At the same time, the man may feel that he is doing his best, that he is trying to balance multiple responsibilities, that he is navigating a situation that does not have a simple solution. And that may be true, but effort alone is not always enough, because relationships require more than intention. They require clarity of action. They require the ability to say, through behavior, "This is where I stand." Without that, both partners are left interpreting, guessing, adjusting, without a stable reference point, and that is exhausting for both. So the question becomes not whether the relationship can survive pressure, but whether it can survive ambiguity, because ambiguity over time erodes connection, not abruptly, but gradually, subtly, almost invisibly, until one day the relationship feels different, not because something dramatic happened, but because clarity was never established. And that is why this moment matters so much, because this is the point where the relationship can either be defined or drift, where clarity can either be established or delayed. And the difference between those two paths is not small. It determines whether the relationship becomes something that is actively built or something that is passively experienced. And so the deeper question is this: is this relationship being held with intention, or is it being carried by uncertainty? Because love without clarity does not disappear, but it does begin to lose its direction. And without direction, even the strongest connection can slowly begin to drift apart. At a certain point in this journey, the question stops being about whether he is confused, or whether the relationship is strong enough, or whether the family will eventually accept it. The question becomes far more personal and far more decisive, What kind of life is he willing to stand behind? Because choosing is not just about selecting a partner, it is about selecting a direction. It is about saying, this is the life I am willing to build, and this is the person I am willing to build it with. And that statement carries weight, not just emotionally, but psychologically. For many men in this position, the idea of choosing feels heavy because it implies consequences. And consequences introduce responsibility. And responsibility removes the comfort of ambiguity. But ambiguity, while it may feel safer in the short term, has its own cost. Because when you do not choose, you are still making a decision. You are choosing not to decide. And that in itself shapes your life in a very real way. It affects your relationship. It affects your partner's sense of security. It affects your family dynamics. And perhaps most importantly, it affects your relationship with yourself. Because every time you avoid making a clear choice, you are reinforcing a pattern. That your decisions are negotiable, that your direction is flexible, and that your own voice is not yet fully trusted. And over time, that can weaken your sense of self. So the real work here is not simply deciding between two external forces. It is strengthening your internal position to the point where you can make a decision and stand by it. That requires clarity, not absolute certainty, but enough clarity to move forward with intention. And clarity does not come from overthinking. It comes from reflection. From asking yourself difficult, honest questions. What matters most to me? What kind of partner do I want to be? What kind of life do I want to build? And am I willing to accept the consequences of choosing one path over another? These are not easy questions, but they are necessary, because without them, the decision will always feel unstable. And instability leads to hesitation. And hesitation, in turn, leads to disconnection. Not immediately, but gradually. So making a conscious choice is not about eliminating risk. It is about acknowledging it and deciding to move forward anyway. This is where emotional accountability becomes essential, because once a decision is made, the responsibility does not end. It begins. If he chooses his partner, then the work becomes about protecting and nurturing that relationship, about communicating clearly, about establishing boundaries with family in a way that respects both sides, about showing through consistent action that the choice is not just spoken, but lived. If he chooses his family, then the responsibility shifts in a different direction. It becomes about accepting that decision fully, about recognizing what may be lost and making peace with it, about not holding resentment toward the relationship that was not chosen or toward himself for the choice he made. Because what often creates internal conflict is not the decision itself, but the lack of acceptance of that decision. People want to choose without consequence, to commit without cost, to decide without fully stepping into the responsibility that comes with it. But that is not how meaningful decisions work. Every choice involves trade-offs, and maturity is the ability to recognize that and to take ownership of those trade-offs without blaming others for the outcome. Another important aspect of this process is boundaries. Because once a choice is made, boundaries define how that choice is protected. Boundaries are not about shutting people out. They are about defining what is acceptable and what is not. They are about creating a space where your decision can exist without being constantly undermined. For example, if he chooses his partner, then boundaries may involve how much influence his family has over the relationship, how much information is shared, how disagreements are handled, how respect is maintained on both sides. Without boundaries, even a clear decision can become unstable, because external pressure will continue to influence the relationship unless it is consciously managed. And setting boundaries is not an act of rebellion. It is an act of clarity. It says, this is my decision and I am responsible for how it is maintained. At the same time, boundaries must be paired with respect, because choosing one thing does not require disrespecting another. He can respect his family without allowing them to control his life. He can value their input without giving them the final say. He can maintain connection without sacrificing autonomy. And that balance between connection and independence is what defines emotional maturity, because it is easy to choose love when there is no resistance, and it is easy to follow family when there is no internal conflict. But the real test comes when both are present at the same time. And in that moment, the ability to choose consciously becomes the defining factor. Because a conscious choice is not made from pressure, it is made from clarity, and clarity allows him to move forward without constantly revisiting the decision. It allows him to invest fully in what he has chosen, rather than remaining partially attached to what he has not. And that shift from hesitation to commitment is what transforms the experience of the relationship. Because commitment changes behavior. It changes how he shows up. It changes how he communicates. It changes how he navigates challenges. And those changes over time create stability. So the question is no longer simply, what should he choose? The deeper question is he ready to choose at all? Because not choosing is also a choice, and it shapes everything. But choosing with awareness, with acceptance, and with responsibility, that is where life begins to move forward. And the reflection I leave you with is this: if you do not choose your life with intention, you will find yourself living a life shaped by hesitation. And the question is not whether that life will be easy, but whether it will truly be yours.